I remember the first time it happened, like a spark you didn't see coming but can't unsee afterward. I was stacking boxes in the back of the bookstore, the late afternoon sunlight cutting across the shelves in slanted gold stripes, and she walked in. Not through the automatic doors, but with the kind of presence that made the air tilt, like the room had just leaned in closer to watch her. I wasn't supposed to be paying attention. I had tasks, deadlines, the hum of fluorescent lights over my head. But she paused in the aisle, finger tracing the spine of a worn novel, as if it were the most delicate thing in the world. Her fingers lingered just slightly too long, and I caught the little flex of her wrist. Something about that tiny motion, I swear it, stuck in my chest like a chord I couldn't place. She noticed me noticing. There was a flicker, almost imperceptible, of amusement in her eyes. Not teasing, not flirty exactly, but something that made my stomach tighten for reasons I couldn't name. She tilted her head, and the sun caught the strands of her hair, turning them amber. I had the sudden, ridiculous thought that maybe the whole world had shrunk to the width of that aisle and the space between us. "I'm looking for something that'll remind me why I started reading again," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, the kind that usually would make me nod and smile politely. Keep it professional. But today, I caught myself just staring. I think I can help," I said, fumbling for a title that might actually make sense. I tried to sound confident, but my hands were shaking slightly, and I knew it. She leaned a little closer to read the cover, and I noticed the faint scent of jasmine that clung to her coat, a perfume that wasn't overpowering, but impossible to ignore. There was a pause, a small one, maybe 3 seconds, but long enough to feel like the quiet had weight. She looked at me then, properly, not just as someone behind the counter, but as if she was trying to see something deeper. I couldn't look away. "Why do you do this?" she asked softly, and I wasn't sure if she meant helping people pick books or me. I stuttered something dumb, and she smiled, that kind of smile that seems to both forgive you and read you completely. It made me feel, suddenly, like I was both invisible and fully exposed at the same time. Then she placed the book on the counter with an elegance that seemed casual but precise, as though the gesture itself was a quiet act of trust. "Keep it," she said. "You might need it more than I do." I reached for it reflexively, and our fingers brushed. Just a fraction of a second, but I swear the air shifted. I said nothing. Couldn't. I watched her leave, turning down the narrow aisles, each step deliberate, each glance over her shoulders slicing through me like I was too young, too inexperienced, too everything. And then, at the door, she paused, just for a heartbeat, and the sunlight caught her smile in a way that made it look both impossible and inevitable. I stood there, holding the book, my chest tight. My mind was racing, my heart trying to find a rhythm it hadn't felt before. "If this is wrong, why does it feel right?" I whispered under my breath, the sentence sticking there like an echo I couldn't shake, even as the door swung closed behind her. And somehow, I already knew. I was going to think about her tomorrow, and the next day, and probably every day after that I didn't expect to see her again so soon. The bookstore was quiet that evening, the kind of lull that usually makes me wonder if anyone even notices the hours passing. And then there she was, standing near the poetry section, coat draped over one arm, hair pulled loosely at the nape of her neck. She looked tired, more tired than anyone should look at the end of a Tuesday, but still impossibly poised. I couldn't find the last book in the series," she said, brushing her fingers along the shelf as if testing its patience. Her voice carried a faint hesitation, like she wasn't sure if asking for help was the right thing. I noticed the way her shoulders slumped slightly, almost imperceptibly, and I realized she didn't often let herself be looked after. "Maybe I can help?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She turned her head just slightly, one brow raised, that quiet evaluation I'd come to recognize as both curiosity and caution. "Thanks," she said, and her voice cracked just a hair at the end. Something about that tiny fissure made my chest tighten. She didn't usually let anyone see that side of her, I thought. Careful, controlled, always composed, and yet here it was. Vulnerable, real. I led her to the back shelf where the book should have been. She followed a step behind me, hands brushing against her coat absent-mindedly, fingers fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. I noticed everything: the delicate curve of her hands, the faint tremor in one finger, the sigh she let out when the right book finally appeared. "Here," I said softly, handing it to her. Our fingers touched for a brief second, and I swore the air between us thickened, charged in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights overhead. She held the book, hesitating, then looked up at me. Her eyes lingered longer than necessary, and I caught a shadow of something. Maybe fatigue, maybe the weight of keeping herself in check. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small, human gesture that made her look different, more tangible, more fallible. "I've been reading this series again," she admitted quietly, almost to herself. I guess I needed to remember what it felt like to escape for a while. There was a pause, the kind that stretches but never cracks. She didn't explain, didn't elaborate, just let the words hang there, and I could feel their weight. "I understand," I said, though I wasn't sure I fully did. I just wanted her to know I noticed, that I cared, in the quietest way possible. For a moment, we both just stood there, the soft hum of the store around us, the air between us heavy with unspoken thoughts. Her gaze flicked to mine and held it, steady, guarded, curious, and I felt something stir, gentle but impossible to ignore. She smiled then, the smallest fraction, almost apologetic, almost secretive. "Thanks for helping," she said, and the way she lingered a second longer than needed made me wonder if she felt it too. The pull, the tension, the delicate boundary we were both towing without realizing. And then she walked away, book clutched to her chest, and I watched her go, my fingers brushing the edge of the shelf where we had just stood. I could still feel her presence lingering, like the faint warmth of sunlight that doesn't quite fade, leaving me with the quiet, unsettling thought: I wanted to see her like that again. The rain had started earlier that evening, drumming against the bookstore windows in a steady rhythm that made everything feel smaller, more intimate. I was shelving a stack of returned books when she appeared in the doorway, coat soaked, hair plastered to her face in damp tendrils. "Sorry, I didn't mean to track water in," she said, shaking off droplets that landed on the worn floor. But she didn't seem flustered, just tired, guarded, the kind of tired that doesn't let you relax even when you're alone. I handed her a towel I kept behind the counter. Our fingers brushed briefly again. That tiny touch, fleeting as it was, sent a jolt straight to my chest. She took the towel, and for a moment we just stood there, letting the silence stretch, comfortable but loaded. "Do you ever feel like some things are easier to share with a stranger?" she asked softly, eyes on the rain-slicked street outside. Her voice carried a weight, the kind that suggests secrets too heavy to name. I wanted to answer honestly, wanted to tell her that yes, sometimes the only person who can see the edges of your chaos is someone who isn't supposed to matter. But I didn't. Instead, I said, maybe. Depends on the stranger, I guess. My voice sounded hollow to my own ears. She laughed quietly, a short, low sound that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Careful. You're starting to sound mysterious," she said, turning her gaze to mine. But her expression shifted before I could read it fully. An almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw, a blink too slow, like she was pulling back before letting herself feel too much. I noticed the way she held the towel, fingers pressing into the fabric, knuckles white. Every tiny gesture spoke volumes: fatigue, restraint, self-protection. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the tension of wanting to cross the line but knowing I couldn't, shouldn't. A phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She glanced at it, hesitated, and then sighed. "I have to take this," she said, moving toward the counter. The screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize. Her voice changed subtly as she spoke, polite, controlled, like she had shifted into a different version of herself. I wanted to reach out, to tell her I'd wait, but I stayed frozen, biting back words that would have been too much. When she ended the call, she leaned against the counter, gaze flicking toward mine. There was a charged pause, the kind that makes the air thick with everything unsaid. I could see it in her eyes, the part of her that wondered if letting someone in, even a little, was worth the risk. The rain outside picked up, hammering on the glass. She tilted her head slightly, and for a heartbeat, our faces were close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, the faint curve of her lips. My hand itched to reach out, to brush that strand of wet hair from her face, to close the tiny distance that shouldn't be crossed. But I didn't. She straightened, collected herself, and murmured, "I should go before I ruin the moment." Her words hung there, both a warning and a confession. She walked to the door, the bell above it jingling as she left. I stood frozen behind the counter, chest tight, staring at the empty space she'd occupied, my fingers twitching toward the counter where hers had just rested. I couldn't stop thinking about how close we'd been and how impossibly far away she already was. The cafe was almost empty, the kind of place where the hum of the espresso machine felt louder than conversations. I was perched on the edge of a chair, arms wrapped around my coffee cup like it was an anchor, when she slid into the seat across from me. Her coat was damp again, rain dripping onto the floor unnoticed, and she didn't take her eyes off me. We didn't speak at first. Silence stretched between us, heavy and almost painful, punctuated only by the occasional hiss of steaming milk. I wanted to ask something, anything, but my throat felt tight, words trapped somewhere I couldn't reach. Finally, she leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. "What are we doing?" she asked quietly. Not accusing, not teasing, just the raw weight of someone trying to understand a situation that had no clear rules. I blinked, surprised at how the question landed. Everything we'd been skirting around, the stolen glances, the brushing hands, the tension that made ordinary gestures feel like confessions, was suddenly named. And I had no answer. I don't know, I admitted. My voice was low, unsure, carrying more of my heart than I wanted to show. I could see her shoulders stiffen slightly, but she didn't pull back. She stayed, listening, waiting, like the answer mattered more than judgment. Her gaze was unwavering, scanning me with a kind of intensity that left me exposed. I noticed every detail, the faint crease by her eye, the subtle tremor in her fingers as she wrapped them around her cup, the way her lips pressed together just a little too tightly. She was holding herself together, but I could see the edges fraying. "I don't know either," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And maybe that's why it's so hard." She looked down at her hands, then back up, and I felt the weight of her honesty pressing into me. There was no flirtation, no coyness, just clarity, vulnerability laid bare. The cafe seemed to shrink around us. The steaming cups, the clinking spoons, the distant laughter, they all faded into the background. All that remained was her, and me, and the tiny, unbearable space between knowing and wanting. I leaned slightly forward, careful, cautious, not wanting to cross a line that might snap everything we had left. "Do you ever wonder if this is going to end badly?" I asked, more to myself than to her. Her eyes softened, but the tension didn't lift. "Every day," she admitted. Then she shook her head slightly, a half-smile breaking through the anxiety. "And yet, I can't stop thinking about it. About you." The words hung there, almost unbearable, and I realized the ground beneath us had shifted. We could no longer pretend this was normal. Whatever this was, whatever pull existed between us, it had grown teeth. We didn't speak after that. Not immediately. She sipped her coffee. I traced the rim of my cup with my finger, and we let the quiet do the work. It was heavier than words, charged with something that neither of us could name. And then she said it, so softly I almost didn't hear. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I'm already falling, and I can't stop." I froze, the sentence carving a hollow in my chest that I didn't think could ever fill. We're now at the emotional peak, where restraint meets vulnerability. The day started ordinary. I was stacking deliveries in the back of the bookstore, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above blending with the distant traffic outside. And then she appeared, sliding in like she always did, but with something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Hesitation, maybe even fear. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice low, almost fragile. She held a small envelope, worn at the edges, as if it had traveled through years of hesitation before arriving here. "What is it?" I asked, though my chest already tightened. She looked away, fumbling with the envelope. It's from a long time ago, from someone I lost. I didn't think I'd ever keep it, let alone show it to anyone. Her hands shook slightly. I noticed how her nails caught the light, tiny imperfections made fragile by the tremor. She slid it across the counter toward me. I don't usually talk about this, she said. Not with anyone. But I feel like I can with you. I hesitated before opening it, careful not to seem too eager. The handwriting was delicate, almost painfully familiar, and I realized this wasn't just a letter. It was a fragment of her past, a piece of her heart she'd kept hidden. She watched me as I read, eyes darting, lips pressed tightly together. I noticed the way she exhaled quietly, like she was letting go of something heavy. The letter was simple, full of ordinary words that carried extraordinary weight. Apologies, confessions, regrets she hadn't spoken aloud. I lost him, she said quietly, almost to herself. And I never really got over it. I thought I had, but her voice trailed off, and I didn't interrupt. I just let her words hang in the air. I wanted to say something that mattered, something that wouldn't break the fragile trust she'd placed in me. I can't imagine what that feels like, I said. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore. My own words felt clumsy, inadequate, but I hoped she heard the sincerity underneath. She looked at me then, and for a moment the walls she always built around herself faltered. Her lips quivered, eyes glistening in the dim store light. I thought I'd forgotten how to feel anything real, she whispered. But you make me feel like I can again. And that scares me. I reached out, almost without thinking, and touched the edge of her hand. Not fully, just enough to let her know I was there. She didn't pull away, but neither did she move closer. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with everything we hadn't yet dared to name. Then she smiled faintly, a fragile, uncertain thing. I didn't expect today to feel like this. Her thumb brushed against the envelope again, as if grounding herself to reality, but I could see the tremor in her chest, the subtle shift in her energy. And for the first time, I felt it too. The weight of something unspoken, something seismic in its quietness. The air between us hummed with potential, and I realized, just as she looked at me again, that nothing would ever feel ordinary after this moment. The bookstore was closing, the last few customers gone, leaving only the smell of old paper and polished wood. I was stacking returned novels when she appeared in the doorway again, coat in hand, hair falling loosely around her face. She didn't speak at first. She just looked at me, and I could tell by the way her eyes softened that she had made a decision, or maybe just accepted something she had been denying. I stayed longer than I should have, she said finally, voice low, almost confessional. But I wanted to see if it felt the same. She let the words hang there, unfinished, and I didn't answer immediately. I didn't need to. We moved through the quiet aisles together, almost unconsciously close, as if the physical space between us had shrunk over weeks of tension, glances, and small moments. I noticed the faint scent of her hair, the way her coat brushed against mine, the subtle rhythm of her breathing. Everything that had felt electric before now felt inevitable, familiar, like gravity. She stopped by the poetry section, fingers trailing along the spines of the books. I reached out instinctively, lightly brushing her hand with mine. She didn't pull away, didn't flinch, just let the contact linger, natural and unforced. It was enough. "Do we?" she began, then paused, the question unfinished. I didn't answer with words. I just mirrored her movement, letting my shoulder brush against hers, letting the silence say what neither of us could quite speak. The tension of weeks, the almost moments, the restrained glances, all collapsed into a shared acknowledgement. She laughed softly, almost a whisper, and it was the first real laugh I'd heard from her in a long time. Not performative, not careful, just genuine. I smiled back, the simplest, most human gesture that somehow carried everything we hadn't dared to say. We moved to the back, to a small reading nook tucked behind shelves of novels. She sat, and I did the same, leaving just enough space between us to breathe, but close enough that our knees nearly touched. She leaned slightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and I realized I could stay here forever, in this quiet, shared space, without needing more. You make it easier, she said quietly, almost to herself, eyes fixed somewhere on the shelf, but not really seeing it. Easier to not fight it. I reached over and gently touched the back of her hand, thumb brushing her knuckles. She looked down at our hands for a moment, then back at me, and I saw a vulnerability there that didn't need words. No declarations, no dramatic confessions, just presence, understanding, and quiet surrender. We sat like that for what felt like hours, letting the world outside exist without us, letting the tension dissolve into something soft, earned, and inevitable. The storm that had built between us was gone, leaving only the quiet certainty that we were finally allowed to be honest with ourselves and each other. Eventually, she leaned slightly, forehead resting gently against my shoulder. A small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it said more than words ever could. I wrapped an arm lightly around her, and that was it. Simple, human, final. No fireworks. No fairy tale ending. Just two people, finally aligned, sitting together in silence. And for the first time, it felt completely right. I still think about that day sometimes. The quiet, ordinary afternoon when everything shifted between us, though neither of us made it loud or dramatic. Sitting in the bookstore, the rain tapping gently against the windows, I realized that some moments don't need words to be understood. Some truths don't need declarations. Looking back, I can see how much we changed without even noticing it at the time. She learned to let someone in again, to soften the edges she'd spent years sharpening around herself. I learned patience, the kind that comes not from waiting for something to happen, but from understanding that the most meaningful things unfold slowly, deliberately, and often quietly. I remember the small details most vividly. The tilt of her head when she laughed, the subtle way she held the book as if it were an extension of herself, the quiet exhalation when she realized she could trust me with her past. Those moments built a bridge between us, brick by fragile brick, until the span was strong enough to hold the weight of something neither of us had expected but both had hoped for. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward pauses, misunderstandings, nights where we both questioned what we were doing. There were small jealousies, hesitations, the inevitable weight of past heartbreaks. But it was ours, every messy, beautiful part of it, and that made it feel real. I think about how her presence became a kind of gravity in my life. I'd catch myself watching her from across a room, not in longing or obsession, but in appreciation for the way she existed, unapologetically herself, and somehow let me exist alongside her without fear or pretense. And I think she felt the same, though she'd never say it outright. Love, I've learned, doesn't always announce itself with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes it's in shared silences, in small, deliberate touches, in the quiet acknowledgement that someone has seen the unpolished parts of you and stayed anyway. That kind of love sneaks in unnoticed at first, then becomes the center of your world so subtly you don't even realize it's there until you're living inside it. Even now, months later, I can feel it. A glance, a smile, a shared moment of understanding. Enough to remind me that the risk was worth it. We are both different people than we were when this started. She's softer, braver, willing to take emotional chances she wouldn't have before. I'm steadier, more attentive, more aware of the fragile beauty in being with someone who matters more than the rest of the world. And yet, there's still that quiet spark, the subtle electricity that first drew me to her. It hasn't dulled. It doesn't need to. It's a constant reminder that the best parts of life often come quietly, unannounced, and completely unearned, but entirely deserved. So here we are, not perfect, not complete in the fairy tale sense, but exactly where we're supposed to be, together, in a shared space of trust, understanding, and quiet devotion. And somehow, that feels more powerful than any grand declaration ever could. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?